we're getting ready for Thanksgiving. And we're starting a brand new sermon series to help our church get ready with this new sermon series titled The Spirituality of Gratitude. Many of you, know that our church has been going through a devotional together based on this book. It is the book titled The Spirituality of Gratitude by Reverend Pastor Joshua Kang. And, I've been so encouraged by so many of you who have been writing to me and sharing with me how blessed you guys are by, reading the devotionals on a weekly basis. And it's blessing you all to help you to slow down just a little bit, to not only to slow down, but to notice God's blessings in the small things, as well as to live with a deeper sense of thankfulness. Now, if you're new to our church, that's okay, and you haven't been receiving these weekly devotionals, but if you would like to receive these devotionals, I send out a devotional every Wednesday morning during the midweek to kind of refresh your souls, with God's word. And so if you would like to be included in these emails, just simply come talk to me or talk to one of the the leadership team members, and just let them know or let me know you would like your email to be inputted into the weekly devotionals, and I would be happy to send them out to you. We have a list of now, I think 90 people now. I started with like 30 4 years ago in this church. Now we have 90 people that it goes out to. So if you'd like to be part of that list, please let me know. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be going through what it really means to live this life of gratitude. This week, we're going to talk about the source of gratitude. Where does gratitude come from? Then next week, we're going to explore the power of gratitude. And then the third week, we're going to be talking about the gifts of gratitude. And then finally, we're going to conclude by celebrating Thanksgiving together on Sunday, November 23rd, with a church-wide potluck. So I want to invite every single one of you on Sunday, November 23rd, to our potluck Thanksgiving fellowship. It's going to be really fun. And so it's going to be a beautiful month where we're going to be reflecting upon gratitude. We're going to be worshiping, and then we're going to also understand this concept of thankfulness. And I'm so glad that we're able to walk together as a church through this new sermon series. And so this morning, I just want to quickly ask, where does gratitude come from? Where does it begin? What is the source of gratitude? And according to this devotional book, Pastor Kang actually argues that gratitude begins in all of the hard places. In the hard places. Have you ever met someone who seemed genuinely thankful even when life does not make sense for that person? I don't know if you've met such people, but I think of the mother who is battling an illness, yet she still lifts her voice to thank God for every day that she gets to live. I think of people like Esther, who did that during the hospital while I was visiting her. Even in hospice, she was just so thankful every day. Even though she was dying of cancer, she was so thankful. I think about a man who just lost their job. And that is actually happening a lot at a greater pace now with the economy where it is. But I think of the man who lost his job, yet somehow gives thanks to God in all circumstances. And he is still trusting in God for his next job. Then I think about the youth, or I think about young adults who are struggling through loneliness, feeling like they don't have friends, or they want to get married and they're battling loneliness in their life. Yet they're able to see God's blessing through their life and God's presence in their life on a daily basis. You know, it is these people that when I look at them, gratitude doesn't come, it just doesn't come naturally. Like, it's that kind of gratitude doesn't come naturally to us. You know, this kind of gratitude, it's not ordinary, it's actually supernatural. And so today I want to talk about where that gratitude comes from, what the Bible shows us as the true sources of gratitude. And the surprising truth this morning is that gratitude isn't born in seasons of prosperity or comfort. Rather, they're born in the hard places, in the painful seasons of life, in the moments that stretch and shape us. And so this morning, we're going to look at 3 sources of gratitude that God often uses to grow our hearts. And the first source we're going to see is gratitude in isolation. You know, sometimes before God can do a deep work through us, He first has to do a deep work within us. You know, and that often happens in the quiet, lonely places, in seasons of isolation. I don't know if you've ever felt cut off or you felt isolated from people, or maybe you felt isolated from purpose in life, or even you felt isolated from God Himself. You know, isolation can many times feel like a prison of its own, where you feel like you can't get out. And you feel surrounded by, even though you're surrounded by people, and even though, you know, you have friends around you, many times you feel unseen in these places of isolation. And you feel unknown, and you feel many times forgotten. You know, there's a character in the book of the Bible in the Old Testament in Genesis by the name of Joseph. He felt this feeling very well, this feeling of isolation. Joseph was a man who was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery, and then he was later thrown into prison for something he didn't even do. It's a crime that he did not even commit, yet he was thrown into prison. And Joseph's story in Genesis is marked by long years of silence and isolation. So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 39 and take a look at what the verse says about this man Joseph. In Genesis chapter 39, specifically we're going to look at verses 20 to 21. It says this: Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. You know, this simple phrase, the Lord was with him, this is the heartbeat of gratitude in isolation. You see, Joseph may have been locked away from the world, but he was never separated from God's presence. And that awareness of Joseph, to know that God was with him in the most isolated places of life, that made all the difference in the world. You know, gratitude in isolation begins when you and I realize that even when life closes in on us, God's presence never leaves us. I want you to know that. Whether you're a young adult who's going through loneliness, or whether you're a mother who's battling difficulty, or whether you're a father who's just lost his job, no matter what situation you're in, God's presence never leaves us. And we have to be reminded of this over and over again. Joseph knew this, and that's why he didn't waste those years in bitterness. He wasn't angry in prison. He wasn't blaming God for being in prison. Yet the Bible tells us that even in prison, Joseph served faithfully. He also interpreted dreams for others while he was in prison. And he prepared the future that God had for him in that place of isolation. You know, the solitude, this kind of solitude in prison breaks most people. It absolutely devastates people. But that solitude that could break people, instead, for Joseph, it became the sacred ground for his growth. His growth. And I don't want any of us here in this congregation to waste any of these prison years that you feel like you're in. Because God can use them to mold and shape you into this great leader, which he did for Joseph. You see, when God prepares someone for leadership, he often allows them to go through and experience extreme isolation, not to punish you and I, but rather to deepen us, to deepen our character, to firm up our faith. And he did this not just for Joseph, but think about all of the great people in the Bible. Moses, for 40 years, God placed him in the wilderness, all alone. David, King David, in the Bible, in the Psalms, you see that God placed him in these caves and caverns for years, escaping persecution from King Saul. And finally, Paul, the man who wrote more than one half of the entire New Testament. Did you know that he wrote most of those letters in prison when he was in isolation? And Paul spent years in obscurity and isolation before he even started to write his first letter. In every case that we see in the Bible, great men and women of faith, their isolation actually became the school of gratitude, a place where they learned to be content, a place where they learned to trust completely in God, and a place where they really learned to depend fully on the God who never forgot them. And so maybe the question for you and I today is not, why am I here? Why am I going through all this difficulty in life? But instead, maybe the question we should be asking is, Lord, what are you trying to teach me in this time period? What are the lessons of leadership you're trying to ingrain in me as I go through this period of isolation and difficulty? And so even in your season of isolation, the quiet, the loneliness, and the waiting, I want you to know that God's presence is your reason to be grateful. Now, if isolation teaches us that God is with us, then the second thing I want us to see that Pastor Kang talks about is gratitude and humility. Humility actually teaches us that we need Him, that we need God. Gratitude begins to blossom when we come down from the high places in life. The places of pride, the place of self-reliance, the place where we want to control everything. And when we find ourselves in the opposite place, in the low places, that's where we get to clearly see the Lord. True gratitude doesn't grow in the soil of entitlement and position, in high positions, but gratitude grows in the soil of our humility when we're low. To be grateful is to see things differently, to have our eyes opened by grace. Pastor Kang talks about this when he says that we begin to notice the goodness of God in the small things in life. Ordinary things like the kindness of a friend, or the laughter of a small child, or the beauty of a simple sunrise, which we see here in Colorado. And Pastor Kang, actually, I'm going to read what he says. He says, even the ability to be grateful is not our own effort. It is the result of God's grace. And when God starts to open our eyes, we begin to start to see his fingerprints everywhere around our lives. You know, we can start to see the light in the midst of darkness. We can also see good even through difficult times in your life. And the blessings that we once took for granted, we're able to see things in a new perspective. But this vision can only come from a humble heart. A heart that knows everything we have is a gift. And Jesus is the perfect example of this. Even though Jesus was the highest king and he was the Son of God, Jesus chose to go to the lowest place. Let's take a look in Philippians chapter 2, verse 8. It says this about Jesus. And being found in appearance as a man, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Paul here is writing, by the way, Philippians in jail. It's interesting that he is saying that because of Jesus' humility, you and I are now able to experience the grace and peace of God through Jesus lowering himself in humility. And here's the thing. Humility brings freedom into our lives. Because when you're at the bottom, you know what? There's no further place to fall. There's no place to go when you're at the absolute bottom. And think about the opposite. Those who live on the top, you know, they're always chasing this anxious lifestyle to protect their position on the top. But those who found peace in the low places no longer have anything to prove to anyone, or they don't have anything to protect. That's where the real joy is found. It's found in that freedom of humility. And so gratitude and humility is the ability to say things like this: Lord, you know what? I don't deserve this breath that I'm breathing. I don't deserve the air that I breathe. I don't deserve the meal that I have today. And I don't deserve the clothes that I have on my back. Yet, you have given all of this to me. That can be said from a position of low humility. Whereas someone who is high and mighty in their own things, they say things like, well, this was my money that paid for this. This is my thing that got this. This is my ability that made me become CEO, and I rule all of this. There's a stark difference. And when we start living from the posture of humility in the low places, we stop striving for what's next. And we start thanking God for what is here in the here and now. We discover the deep peace that Jesus Christ experienced. That kind of shalom that can only be found in the low places. And so this morning, if you feel like you're not at the top of your game, if you feel like you're in a low place in life, well, that's actually, according to Pastor Kang, that's a great place to be. Because that's where we actually start to see the blessings in the small things. And conversely, I believe that God uses those types of people when they eventually rise to the top. They're compassionate. They're not these, power-hungry people, who, have no compassion. But I truly believe God uses those people who went from low to the high places so they could show empathy to others. They could show love and compassion. Because you know what it felt like to go hungry. You know what it felt like to not have clothes on your back. And so I truly believe God uses that as a source for gratitude. He uses humility. Finally, last but not least, today I want to talk about gratitude in brokenness. If isolation teaches us that God is with us and humility teaches us that we need God, then this third, brokenness, actually teaches us that God can still use us. You and I. Brokenness is something we all here in this church have experienced. We've all here experienced loss. We've all here experienced disappointment. We've also all here, we've all experienced the wound that won't seem to heal. Many of us carry a lot of deep wounds in this church. And yet the mystery of the gospel is that gratitude often grows best in the soil of brokenness. Where do we get this from? Jesus said in John chapter 12, verse 24, he says this, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." In other words, what Jesus is saying is what looks like death or defeat in our lives, what may look like that, can actually be the beginning of something new and beautiful that God is wanting to do in your lives. One of the most powerful pictures of this truth is found in the story of the woman who anointed Jesus with perfume. Sorry, I know the light's really bright, so it's really difficult to see, but this is an old painting of the woman with an alabaster jar. If you know this story, this woman came with an alabaster jar filled with the most expensive perfume that she owned. And in an act of love and surrender, she broke this jar open at front of Jesus' feet, and she poured it all upon Jesus. And the fragrance filled the air of the entire room. But how was that fragrance able to be filled in the air? It was only able to be filled because that jar was broken. If the jar had been sealed shut right there, you would have never smelled that perfume. But because she broke that jar and poured it on Jesus, that broken jar represents the releasing of that fragrance that so filled the air. The beauty that was hidden inside could only be released through that breaking. And I wonder this morning, how many of us are carrying this kind of expensive perfume in our hearts? I know each and every person in this room carries an expensive fragrance in your life. And unfortunately, many of that expensive fragrance comes through at the expense of your pain and suffering. And I know this is not an easy thing to say, but many of you here, because you suffered, you have in your hearts the gift of compassion. Because you suffered, you have the gift of joy within you, and empathy, and the gift of love. Everyone in this room carries some special gift. But until we are broken, and until we pour ourselves out, that gift can never be released. And that fragrance that you and I all carry through the hurt and the pain of suffering, it stays locked inside of us. It doesn't get to be released. And it is through that breaking that your testimony gains power. It is through that breaking that your compassion grows for other people. It's through that breaking that your gratitude actually becomes real. You know, I know this because I'm not going to say names or, point people out. But in that youth group right now, there are some kids in that youth group who are, they're foster kids. Their parents are no longer with them, and now they're living in a foster home. And I've talked to some of those kids, and one of them yesterday while we were cleaning, she was like, Pastor Howard, I don't know, there's something about this place that makes me feel so wanted, that makes me feel so loved, that I don't feel judged in this church. And I actually like it here. And there's another boy who's also a foster child, and he loves coming to this church. And when I asked him why, he said the same things. He said, the people in your church, they don't judge. I feel at home here. And you would never think that. But why? You know why? Because there are some of you here sitting in this room who knows what it feels like to be abandoned by your parents. And I know this is not easy because it was so hard to go through that in life. It was difficult. But yet, through that pain, through that suffering, when you're able to go deep into that brokenness and break that chain, that cycle, and you release that fragrance, guess what? You become a testimony and a living testimony to these high school kids who don't have parents right now. And you become the greatest testimony in their life of what it means to live a life of grace. What it means to live a life of compassion, what it means to live a life of love. This world does not need a church that's perfect. Man, I'll tell you, and if any church says they're perfect, beware. Get away from that place, because that's just not true. You know what the world needs? The world needs a church that's broken, but grateful. People who know what it means to walk through pain, yet to be able to say, God is good. And now I want to pour my love out to you. The alabaster jar that you see in front of you wasn't wasted when it was broken. Rather, the beautiful fragrance was actually released because it was broken. And I want to encourage you this morning that your brokenness too does not have to be wasted. God can use your brokenness to release something fragrant and beautiful out into this world who's hurting and in pain, pointing back to the Jesus Christ who himself was the one who was broken for us. And so in closing, as we come to the end of our time this morning, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we have learned together today that comes through this devotional book. Gratitude is not something we only feel when life is easy. Actually, gratitude is a supernatural response. It's a gift from God that grows in all the hard places of life. And I want to remind us all that, number one, in isolation, we discover that God is with us, even when no one else seems to be around us. And number two, in humility, we see that every blessing, every gift, every moment of life is a gracious gift from God. And our hearts start to overflow with thankfulness when we're in that humble place. And third, finally, last but not least, I want to remind us once again that in brokenness, it is in brokenness that we realize that our treasures are inside of us. That our love, our gifts, our form of compassion through things like even angel tree, that they can only be released when we surrender them to God, when we break this hard shell, the alabaster jar of our hearts, allowing God to transform our pain into something beautiful for His glory. And so today, as you sit in this sanctuary, or whether you're listening from home on our YouTube channel, I want to remind you of this, that God is not done with any of you yet. Where you've felt broken, He is shaping you into something fragrant, into something beautiful, something that points to His goodness. And so as I close, I invite you to take a moment this morning quietly in your heart to bring before the Lord the places of isolation, the places of humility, and the places of brokenness in your life. As we pray today, ask Him to help you see His presence in your life and ask Him to receive His grace and live this life of gratitude, even in the most difficult seasons of your life. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.